Zechariah chapter 13. Zechariah chapter 13. I almost wonder whether I'll tell John to push the pause button back there for a moment while I make this statement to you, but I guess I'll make it openly. All of your questions about chapter 13 and 14, my answer is, I don't know. I'll be honest with you. This has been the hardest two chapters to me to try to figure out than anything else I think I've come across in Scripture. And usually the reason for that is, I'm kind of a content Bible student. If I can kind of see where something's going, if I know where it's heading, then I can kind of understand what the language is that's leading to it. Or if I can understand what happened prior to it, and then I can understand how it's describing it, then I can kind of make sense out of those things. But these two chapters seem to be almost in conflict in the sense that there's one minute you think Jerusalem's being attacked, and the next minute you think Jerusalem's being protected and saved. And it's hard to know, is he pointing to a particular period in time? Is he dealing with some, is this just all related to the time period in which Jesus arrives on the scene? It's hard to tell exactly what is it that he's pushing for here or towards in all of this language. And so we're going to do our best to try to extract what we can from it and try to get an understanding of the symbolism and the imagery and the prophecy that's being offered here. I still contend that we're still pointing to Jesus. There's still language in the narrative that talks about the piercing and that kind of thing that may still point us to the fact that this is a prophecy pointing to Jesus, and that in some senses those who live in Jesus' day would be able to look back at this and say, oh yeah, that's happening now. That's the Savior. That's the Messiah. Because remember, that's the reason for that, right? All of that prophecy and all those messianic conversations and all those things that it addresses has a purpose and a reason. And the reason is so that the contemporaries of Jesus, when Jesus arrives on the scene, had there been false messiahs? Yes. Were there even false messiahs after Jesus had gone? Yes. And so you were going to have some ability to be able to discern who's who and who's telling the truth and how can we validate that. And the best way to be able to validate that Jesus of Nazareth was legitimately the Son of God could come in a variety of ways. One, you could look at the signs and wonders that He did, right? You could see the actual proof in Himself to evidence that. But you could also go back to these prophecies and examine what it is that was said about Him, how He would arrive, when He would arrive, those kinds of conversations. And be able to make a discernment about this is the one that the prophets had been speaking of. Because He fits the prophecies relating to Him, and not just coincidentally, but He fits all of them. All of them. And so you've got that kind of discussion, I think, happening somewhat within this particular narrative. And so we'll try to keep that thought in the forefront of why these things are being written, even if we're challenged a little bit understanding exactly what it is that he's pointing to as it relates to these matters. So here in Zechariah chapter 13, in that day there shall be a fountain open. By the way, and why I say that this is probably still pointing to the time of Jesus is because that phrase, in that day, in that day, in that day, is happening repeatedly throughout the narrative. And if we can clearly kind of understand that he's pointing, that phrase in earlier context was pointing to the time of Jesus, then I don't know of any reason to all of a sudden now flip and say, well, it's pointing to some other point. I think that if there's consistency within the prophecy, then you're probably pointing to every time you see that within this context, you're pointing to the same period of time. But anyway, in that day there should be a fountain open to the house of David, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. That seems pretty clear, right? Who's the answer to sin and uncleanness? Jesus is. He was of the household of David, right? And so it fits pretty clearly as it points to Jesus. It shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land. They shall no more be remembered, and also I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. Did that happen in the days of Jesus? Yes, right? You remember those moments where people were casting out demons and casting out devils and unclean spirits. That happened in the time of Jesus and during the time of the apostles. Those things occurred in that day and in that time period. So Zechariah kind of points, by the way, and we've studied this in the past in other contexts, talking about unclean spirits and demon possession, that kind of thing, how Zechariah kind of helps us out because he kind of points to the fact that in that day, time of Jesus, is when these unclean spirits would exist and they would be forced out, right? And you see that evidenced in New Testament times. You see that actually occur. And so Zechariah kind of helps us frame the time period of those kinds of events as surrounding the time period of Jesus and His apostles as it fulfills those things. And it shall come to pass that when then he shall yet prophesy, then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, Thou shalt not live, for thou speakest lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and his mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesieth. And so we talked briefly about this Wednesday night. But think about this for a moment. So Jesus said when He would come into existence, He came to put mother against father and father against son and daughter, right? He understood that His message was not going to be universally received. And when it's universally received and you've got two family members and the dad believes and the wife doesn't, or the father believes and the son doesn't, or the son does and the mother doesn't, it puts people in conflict. And even when they would see false prophets, even if it was within their own family, they were willing to expose that and acknowledge that even their own loved ones were speaking lies. And ultimately, 1 Corinthians 13 will illustrate that it fulfills its purpose, and once that purpose has been fulfilled, it no longer is necessary. Once the fullness of the gospel has come, it's no longer necessary in order to keep those things. So he could very well be pointing to the idea that if people keep telling us about future, and even particularly as it relates to a coming Messiah, then that has to be put to rest because the Messiah has already arrived. He's already fulfilled all prophecies concerning Him. And so to continue to speak those things, specifically if it's messianic, then there's some falsehood there that needs to be addressed. Yeah. Yeah, irregardless of who it might be. Yeah. Yeah. And depending on which law you're discussing and those kinds of things, I agree. It's hard to tell whether he's talking about just putting the message to death or the individual themselves. Well, I mean, particularly in and around. I mean, you go on Paul's journeys, and they're everywhere he goes. Yeah. Well, I understand what you're saying. I'm sure there's influence. I don't know. I mean, I think there's some implication at the temple when there's the trinket sellers and all those things going on that there could have been some connection to kind of an idolatry mindset of images and things that they were still using. And so I guess I would be willing to accept that maybe idolatry isn't as rampant among the Jews as it was among the Greeks or the Romans, but probably still present. But I think the idea there is not, because there's still idolatry. So the concept when he says there that he will cut off the names of the idols out of the land isn't the idea that no one will ever have idolatry again. I think the idea is that it will be a time period in which he removes all those obstacles that the Jews had let stand in the way, and Jesus would come to full fruition as he needed to be. Yeah. Yeah.
It made me think of another place in Scripture, way back at the end of Scripture, where it talks about worshiping an image.
Yeah.
And that's the last idol. That's the last idol that will be worshipped.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts? And again, don't hesitate to speak up, because if you disagree with me, you're probably right. So yeah, it's just difficult. Yeah. So it comes to pass in that day, again, that same phrase, verse 4, that the prophet shall be ashamed every one of his vision when he hath prophesied, neither shall they wear a rough garment to deceive. But he shall say, I am no prophet, I am an husbandman, for man taught me to keep cattle from my youth. And one shall say unto him, what are those wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Now, we spoke about this Wednesday night, and I wanted to come back and just give us a clean start at the beginning of the chapter. Now, I mentioned that in King James in particular, which is what's on the screen, if we saw that wounds in thine hands, our mind will probably jump straight to Jesus and the cross, right? But the problem is that's not who's under discussion. Those under discussion are these prophets who are going to wear a veiled garment, not going to act like prophets anymore. And I talked to you about that the word there kind of means more like wounds in between your hands. Not necessarily in them as in literally in your hands, but between your hands. This fellow's been wounded among his friends, those who have challenged him continuing to prophesy. And so I suppose you might argue that he's just describing what's going to happen among those who realize, I can't prophesy anymore, it's detrimental to me, and how they kind of back away from that. They don't want to claim to be a prophet anymore. I'm just a cattleman, right? I'm just a herdsman. I'm just, and try to change almost their view of, or how people view them. Let me just finish this real quick. But on the other hand, I'm also willing to acknowledge the fact that it could have some reference to Jesus, because where was he wounded? Among his kinsmen, who betrayed him. Yeah, one of his closest. And so there could be, I'm willing to accept the idea, that I could also see some reference to Jesus there. My biggest hardship in that is trying to figure out how it connects to verse 5. When he says, he shall say, and he's still the same person under discussion, he shall say, I am no prophet, I am an husbandman, for man taught me to keep cattle from my youth. Anyway, there might be some connection I'm just missing. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. 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 And that could very well be. Between your arms. And that's what I was saying in terms of the original language, and the definition of those terms gives it a little different kind of meaning than in your hands, and between them is a different kind of language. And that's what makes it kind of difficult. So he says, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man that is my fellow, saith the Lord of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn mine hand upon the little ones. And again, I can kind of, who's the great shepherd? Jesus is, what happens initially when they reach out and take Him there in the garden? Everybody runs, right? Everybody scatters. And so maybe there's some imagery there in relationship to that kind of event and the circumstances surrounding that. He says, "It shall come to pass that in all the land, saith the Lord, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. And I will bring the third part through the fire, and I will refine them as silver is refined, and I will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God." And so, that again, I think you can kind of see that, right? The people scatter. His apostles scattered when he was first taken in the garden. What happens to the people when Saul's wreaking havoc on the church? They scatter. They go back to their homelands. They scatter. But they take the message with them. The New Testament writers talk about having the kind of faith and dedication and commitment to Jesus that is refined where? In the fire, right? And so maybe that's the point here. He's talking about this idea that His people will be evidenced and proven when they come out the other side of the fire, and they're better. They're more purified than they were when they began. And there may be some pointing towards what God's people will look like after the Messiah comes, after that Jesus arrives and they begin to become His disciples and followers of His. Those will be the people. Not the ones, not the 2/3. And remember, Jesus said that broad is the way, right, that leadeth unto destruction, and many that be that go in thereat. Narrow is the way that leadeth unto righteousness or unto God, and few there be that find it. As far as I know, 2/3 is greater than 1/3. So 2/3 may distance themselves from Jesus. 1/3 in the imagery will embrace Him, be willing to go through the fire, be refined by it. And certainly they're going to be refined by fire, particularly in those days. Those who continue to trust and honor Jesus and live by Him as His disciples are going to be met with all kinds of challenges and difficulties because of that. Even death. You go back to that imagery earlier that Bob referenced with the hands. Even death will fall some of them. And those who are willing to kind of sustain themselves through that are really the ones that are the people of God. Not just those who claim to be, but those who are willing to be refined by the fire. Yeah. Thoughts or questions? Chapter 14. So he says, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." Here's where it especially to me gets challenging. He could be, well, you tell me, give me some possibilities you think he might be referencing. Okay, so it's possible that you're talking about some of the conflicts that were going to come during that Greek time period, where we don't have a lot, right? Because you kind of leapfrog it. It exists. There's secular history that tells us things that happened in relationship to that Maccabean period, but the Bible narrative stops, and the Greeks kind of exist within that biblical silence period. Then the Romans come on the scene, Jesus arrives, and the narrative picks back up. And so we don't have a lot of biblical history that there's references. Daniel talks about things that will come. And maybe this is one of those. Maybe this is one of those narratives that references that time period where we don't have a whole lot of biblical history as it relates to. Go ahead, Brian. All of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Take it literally. Take his words literally. And not
Yeah. And so what? Or,
I just take a straightforward approach to it.
yeah.
When it says all, that means all.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you don't necessarily pick a time period, though. That's what I'm pointing to. Hang on one second. Let me.
Well, I mean, like I said,
I'm just asking for food for thought. I'm not putting on. I'm not putting you on. Yeah. Did it happen?
And we have no. I mean, we have no scriptural background saying that all of them came.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it comes down to, do you trust the literal words?
Yeah.
Or do you trust the paraphrase of some other newer version?
Yeah.
And say, oh, all can mean this, mean that.
Yeah. And I agree. And
that's what makes it difficult too.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you could think about AD 70, but we're all nations involved in AD 70. I get what you're saying. It's hard. That's where the difficulty comes. And you're kind of left with trying to give an alternative definition for the word all, or you're left trying to figure out at what point in time did God gather everybody in opposition. Now, I'm willing to argue, by the way, that in a general sense, all nations have been in opposition to whom? To Jesus. Now, maybe not in word, maybe they've not verbalized that, but in their conduct and behavior and their choices and the mannerisms in which they respond to the gospel, then I think maybe in that sense all nations have been in opposition, have battled against Jerusalem, the place in which the truth of Jesus would pour forth. So there could be some of that imagery there. Again, I agree. I scratched my head a little trying to work through it all. Okay, Bob, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah. 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 And there's possibilities that there could be some connection. I do find it interesting that he uses the word, the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. And so if this is a literal battle, then that presents some challenges. We just got done talking about 2/3 and 1/3 and all that, getting to a remnant. And now we've got the word residue. And maybe the imagery is that everybody can come and bring the battle to the Jerusalem, to the message that's coming out of Jerusalem of the Messiah, the Christ, and His gospel message. And the residue, the remnant that will be purified by the fire, willing to persevere through those challenges, will still come out the other side and will still reside in the city. Heaven spoken of as the New Jerusalem. So maybe there's a picture there. Maybe he's just simply pointing to the fact that there can be all kinds of calamity come. But if the residue, the remnant, the 1/3 perseveres, stays steadfast, stays immovable, they're going to be preserved. And ultimately preserved in the New Jerusalem that is to come. I'm just giving you food for thought again. I don't claim to be an expert on the book of Zechariah.
Well, the thing that got me is, we've been studying prophets, and of course this is prophecy. So
yeah.
We've been talking about, the Babylonian captivity and the battles and all that would overtake them. And then we suddenly switch gears.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense with the flow.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And again, I understand that prophecy can be like that sometimes, but it just seems like there's a big shift. And if we take that approach, it's a shift from physical, literal warfare to spiritual warfare, all one thing.
Yeah.
To me, it just doesn't fit.
Yeah. And I understand that. And you almost, and the only thing that ever really even turned me in some sense is that we went from trying to help them understand what they should be doing as a physical nation. were the imageries of Jesus that kept coming up. Here again we're going to see what? In verse 4. Feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. That's a significant, issue as it relates to Jesus, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azal. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. I mean, you can see all kinds of potential imageries there, right? When he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, he talks about don't bother trying to gather anything together. Just what? Just go. Just run. Just flee. Maybe that's the time period he's talking about. It's interesting that he says, the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with him, or with thee. And that imagery seems to point to the time of the second coming. That kind of imagery points more to the time of the second coming of Jesus, when all the saints will come with, that have gone on before will come with Jesus. So it is really, a difficult pathway, because one minute you feel like you got a grasp on what we're talking about and who we're pointing to and when we're pointing to, and then you hear phrases like that and you wonder, okay, maybe we're not. Maybe we're talking about something else. Well, I think that's a possibility, sure. When you're talking about the residue and the remnant and those who honor and are willing, sure, I think that you can have some references there to the idea of the faithful to Jesus, his disciples.
So
that's all right. Go ahead, Gary. No, go ahead, Gary. Yeah. Yeah. If there's a message, if we can kind of pare away some of the details and the imagery that we kind of get lost in, that does seem to be the reoccurring theme. That there's this small number, regardless of whether we're dealing with the time period the Maccabees created problems, whether we're talking about the time period in which the Babylonians created problems, whether we're talking about what's going on during the time when Rome is in charge in the days of Jesus. There's this emphasis throughout this text about the remnant and the residue and the faithful. And maybe there is a message, at least within it, that reminds us that that's where we need to stay, within that remnant and residue. Yeah.
When I first picked up this book, really picked it up about 5 years ago, and I tried to learn how to rightly divide it, and I came across a quote from Miles Coverdale, and I can't speak it exactly, but he said, when you're looking at Scripture, first you have to focus on who is speaking, to whom is it speaking, what are the circumstances, what's the context, what comes after, what comes before. So I guess my question of this book, with Zechariah, is who's it written to?
Yeah.
Because the prophecies in the Old Testament have to do, and please correct me if I'm wrong, have to do with this nation. And, I know sometimes we put application on, it's talking about the cross. And people will say, well, they were looking forward to the cross. They'll say, well, they were saved by looking forward to the cross. They didn't know about the cross yet. so they wrote these things but didn't understand them. And my thing is the audience. Who's the audience? That's my ultimate question. And that's what I have to be careful with when I look at Scripture. To whom is it referring to? Is it talking about Israel? Is it talking about the body of Christ? Who's it talking about?
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that I discern. And because all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. Oh yes, for doctrine, for truth, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes, and I've done this so many times, and I've assumed so much for so long that I spiritualize everything in this book.
Yeah.
And try and make one thing fit. It's like a puzzle.
Yeah.
It's like not a crossword puzzle, but like a jigsaw puzzle, where you try to take one little piece and you try to fit it in a space where it doesn't belong.
Yeah.
And that's my thing.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I want to know who is being referred to and who's the audience.
Yeah. And I agree with you, by the way. And I think that what maybe we do make a mistake sometimes, Brian, is that we see something and we say to ourselves, I've got to make that fit somewhere. And I can't quite figure out exactly where it fits. And so I find a way to just kind of, like a kid doing a puzzle. It's not really right, but I was able to, put my thumb on it and shove it into that spot. And I bent the cardboard a little, but it fits now. And maybe sometimes, and maybe we do make a mistake sometimes of trying to always want to fit it to something, and instead of maybe just accepting the fact that it just was something that he said as it relates to them. Maybe they would have understood exactly what Zechariah was saying in ways that we can't, because what we're doing is trying to fit it into a puzzle, whereas they were just understanding it as it was.
And one thing that I always go back to this verse that we now have more sure word prophecy. They didn't have a complete picture.
Yeah.
We do. A lot of people will say that. No, we don't have the complete picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And well, how can we be sure of certain events?
Yeah.
Perfect standard.
Sure. So it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day or not, nor night. But it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and in winter shall it be. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and His name one. And so again, I think that might be pretty clear as the idea of who was offering the living waters. Jesus was, and who is the single king over all men? Jesus was. And the importance of that one name, not multiple names, but one name that all nations would come and gather around. And certainly preservation of this nation of people is crucial to that purpose that God wants to ultimately fulfill. All the land shall be turned as a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. It shall be lifted up and inhabited in her place. From Benjamin's gate unto the place of the first gate, unto the corner gate, and from the tower of Haneel unto the king's wine presses. And men shall dwell in it. There shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited.
It's never been safe.
Yeah. So here it is again. So for a period of time was Jerusalem safely inhabited from the time of Zechariah's writing. I mean, they're safe for a period of time, but not completely. And there's challenges God will have to protect them from. Again, if you throw in some AD 70 conversation into the mix, maybe you can understand that God ultimately brings that destruction. He does away, at that point in time is when Jerusalem is destroyed, and it's kind of the final straw, if you will, that ends that era of that Israelite physical nation being the primary in God's eyes. You have Jerusalem, potentially spiritual Jerusalem, the church that now stands And you can safely inhabit that Jerusalem, the spiritual body of Christ that nothing can destroy. The gates of hell can't even come up against the kingdom of Jesus. But I don't know. I don't know whether I can make enough of that fit or not. I guess maybe the greater warning here would be then when we can't, go back to some of the things Brian said a few minutes ago. Sometimes, and I know this is unsatisfying to some folks, but sometimes I'm better off leaving that piece that I don't quite grasp off to the side instead of forcing it to fit somewhere that it doesn't. And just acknowledge, I'm not sure about that right now, but it doesn't change this picture. It doesn't change all these other pieces. It doesn't change all these other things that clearly fit into God's scheme and plan and purposes. And just because there's this piece that's unclear and I'm not sure how it fits into the whole, we might make a mistake and create things that aren't true because we tried to make something fit where maybe it really doesn't. And so maybe some word of caution for us. And particularly when it comes to the Old Testament prophecies. Because they've already, for all intents and purposes, they've already done what? Yeah, they're fulfilled. They've already fulfilled their purposes. All I know is this, all things that pointed to Jesus, He fulfilled it. All of it. Right? He fulfilled all of it. So if these are things that relate to Him, we can rest in confidence that He fulfilled it. If they don't relate to Him and related to those in Zechariah's time, then they've already happened as well. And what I think about it doesn't necessarily change either one of those things. Again, just to make sure that we don't go overboard and try to make... Because then what will happen is you'll get into doctrines and philosophies and teachings that are completely egregious towards what God has said about certain matters because we're trying to fit some complicated text into the picture. Wednesday night, I'll briefly come back, finish Zechariah, and then we'll move into Malachi. A much simpler narrative for us to look at.